This was the Europe of 1941. The Nazi blitzkrieg had overwhelmed France, Holland, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and Luxembourg. Russian armies were in desperate retreat. The German Air Force was raining death and destruction on England. Combined Italian and German forces were menacing Egypt. Their objective, to defeat an opposing British army and dominate all North Africa. In Asia, Japanese air and ground forces were driving forward in their bloody conquest of China. Only one of the world's major powers was still not at war: the United States. It was a Sunday afternoon in December 1941, and the Statue of Liberty towered serenely over New York Harbor, as if she were the last symbol of freedom left to the crumbling free world. Afternoon in New York, early morning in Hawaii, and another great harbor where American warships were at dockside or rode at anchor. Planes with cold engines stood idle at nearby Hickam Field, when suddenly, without warning, the immediate Japanese military objective was to knock out United States naval and air power in the Pacific at a single stroke. They reasoned that we were committed to eventual entrance in the war in Europe, convinced that we were incapable of fighting a two-front war. The Japanese were right in their calculations to the extent that Roosevelt and Churchill were to agree that the defeat of Hitler, the most powerful of our enemies, must have priority over an offensive against Japan. They followed sound principles of warfare to concentrate the greatest mass of power against the major objective. But it would be nearly a year before we could muster, train, and move an army overseas to attack the strongest of the aggressors. The first American troops to go into action and engage the enemy were those already in the Philippines under General Douglas MacArthur, whose forces would fight not only that first battle, but after more than 3 long years of combat, the final land battle against the last of the aggressors.
Three days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops landed on Luzon's north coast. The following day, still another Japanese landing was made on Luzon's east coast. On the 21st of December, the main Japanese invasion force hit the eastern shore of the Lingayen Gulf. Troops came pouring ashore from 80 transports. The Japanese onslaught gave General MacArthur only one choice: fight a delaying action, try to regroup his forces. It was a monumental task. The Japanese had struck swiftly, suddenly, devastatingly. They pressed forward unchecked. To save Manila from war's destruction, General MacArthur declared it an open city. Ignoring such humanitarian consideration, the Japanese bombed Manila. On the last day of 1941, MacArthur withdrew to the mountainous terrain of the Bataan Peninsula, for Bataan and Corregidor commanded Manila Bay. The objective was to delay the enemy's entrance to the bay. MacArthur and his battling bastards of Bataan, as the troops in grim humor called themselves, knew they were fighting a losing battle. But they fought on, gaining precious time for us to recover from the disaster at Pearl Harbor and build up our forces. There were other prime targets marked by the Japanese. In December 1941, they took Hong Kong and invaded Malaya. They bombed British Singapore and its great naval base. The British fought back. But it was the same losing fight that our troops were waging in Bataan. On New Year's Day, 1942, the siege of Bataan began. Superior Japanese forces pounded our beleaguered troops for 3 long and agonizing months. On February 22nd, 1942, President Roosevelt ordered General MacArthur to leave the Philippines and proceed to Australia as Supreme Allied Commander in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur turned over his command to General Jonathan Wainwright. MacArthur made the first leg of his journey to Australia by PT boat through enemy-infested waters. And then by plane from Mindanao. Bataan fell on the 9th of April, 1942. Thousands of captured American and Filipino prisoners of war began their infamous death march. Hundreds were to die, felled by exhaustion and by the bayonets of their captors. To those self-designated battling bastards of Bataan who starved and fought on, the nation owes a debt it can never repay. Theirs was a heroism seldom matched. Corregidor remained our last foothold. What once had seemed an impregnable rock fortress now awaited its inevitable doom. The fortunes of the United States and its allies were at their lowest ebb. But the Japanese were soon to learn that their homeland was vulnerable to surprise attack. April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle prepared to take off from the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet. Their target, Tokyo, and 4 other major Japanese cities with carefully selected military targets. It was only 9 days after the fall of Bataan. Never before had such a carrier-based operation been attempted. The psychological effects of the raid on Tokyo were even greater than the material damage inflicted. It raised the morale of all Americans. It shocked the enemy into realization that we had the will and the wherewithal to carry the war to the heart of his own homeland. 3 weeks later, United States Navy planes of a carrier task force struck the Japanese fleet a damaging blow in the Coral Sea. The first naval battle in history to be fought entirely with carrier-based aircraft. While the Navy was starting to make a comeback, General Wainwright surrendered Corregidor. A proud old soldier who had fought in World War I and who now at the age of 59 was surrendering his sword without cause for shame. For he and his men had fought in the finest tradition of the American fighting man. Our stubborn defense of Corregidor had put the Japanese conquest 4 months behind schedule and sent General Hama back to Japan, relieved of his command. In January of 1942, President Roosevelt had addressed Congress and the nation to set new and immediate production goals.
First, to increase our production rate of airplanes so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 60,000 planes, 10,000. 10,000, by the way, more than the goal that we set a year and a half ago. This includes 45,000 combat planes, bombers, dive bombers, pursuit planes. The rate of increase will be maintained, continued, so that next year, 1943, we shall produce 125,000 airplanes, including 100,000 combat planes. Second, to increase our production rate of tanks so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 45,000 tanks, and to continue that increase so that next year, 1943, we shall produce 75,000 tanks. Third, to increase our production rate of anti-aircraft guns so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 20,000 of them, and to continue that increase so that next year, 1943, we shall produce 35,000 anti-aircraft guns. And fourth, to increase our production rate of merchant ships so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall build 8 million deadweight tons as compared with a 1941 completed production of 1,100,000.
Immense forces were mobilizing. Millions of Americans were in training. The infantry, airborne infantry, field artillery, anti-aircraft artillery, armored cavalry, Army Air Corps pilots by the thousands. Woman power as well as manpower. The vitality of all America was surging up to full tide. American labor and management performed miracles. planes, tanks, guns, ammunition. Tens of thousands of items rolled off the lines to supply not only ourselves, but our fighting allies. On the home front, 1942 was a momentous year. Great plans and stratagems were being laid and coordinated. Supplies by the millions of tons poured overseas. Nazi submarines took a heavy toll. But enough ships got through to help sustain our beleaguered allies. In the air, the tables were starting to turn. 1,000 Royal Air Force planes in a single massive saturation raid smashed Cologne, Germany. In the Pacific, our naval aircraft inflicted the first decisive defeat on a large Japanese fleet, winning the Battle of Midway. Was an hour of triumph. There would be others, but they would be slow in coming. Our top military leaders were now taking the high places reserved for them by destiny. General Douglas MacArthur, commander in the Southwest Pacific, and Admiral Chester Nimitz. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was coordinating momentous plans with the Allied Combined Staff in the European theater of operations. General Leslie McNair, commanding general of all American ground forces. General Omar Bradley, commandant of the infantry school, soon to be given a top field command. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding Army Air Forces. General Brehon Somervell moved up to Chief of the Services of Supply with the stupendous task of logistical support for what would finally be an army of many millions deployed throughout the world. The first of our troops began arriving at overseas staging areas. In North Ireland, England, Australia. On bloody Guadalcanal, Army troops relieved battle-scarred and weary Marines to continue the fight for the Solomon Islands. The United States was demonstrating not only a will to fight, but the capability of fighting a two-front war against great odds on far-flung battlefronts half a world apart. 10th of November, 1942, American amphibious forces struck the shores of North Africa. We were, to use an appropriate American phrase, in business. The business of an all-out fight against powerful aggressors who had reached out to conquer the world. We had come thousands of miles, but not for conquest. In 1942, the commander of our ground forces, General Leslie McNair, said it best.
The United States is stretching out its arms to encircle the globe, not in conquest, but in protection. Even with our powerful allies, the task is vast and calls for our utmost all-out effort.
The problem of supply is spoken of as logistics. More specifically, it is the transportation, supply, and quartering of troops, the procurement of all required military equipment and materiel, shipping and distributing cargo to the right place, to arrive at the right time. In World War II, our military planners successfully solved the most stupendous problems of logistics the world has ever known. Our lines of supply fanned out like a network around the world, extending northward to Alaska and the Aleutians, to the Panama Canal, westward across the Pacific to a chain of islands, on to China by way of India, to Burma, to Australia, eastward across the Atlantic to North Africa, the length of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the southern route through the Persian Gulf to Russia, to Great Britain, Iceland, and to Russia by way of Murmansk in the far north, and ultimately the entire continent of Europe. Under Lend-Lease to our allies alone, the services of supply shipped approximately $25 billion worth of war materiel. These included approximately 850,000 pieces of heavy equipment, tanks, locomotives, trucks, Free French forces in North Africa were supplied enough arms and materiel to equip 12 combat divisions. Millions of dollars worth of supplies went to China, flown there from India. Russia alone, over the submarine menaced route to Murmansk, almost 500,000 pieces of heavy equipment, railroad rolling stock, and clothing. Vast stores of munitions and equipment went to England and her Commonwealth. All of this while we were supplying our own widely deployed forces and building up mountains of supplies for the massive invasion of Europe yet to come. The miracle of supply achieved by the United States Army in World War II was historic. It represented the outpouring of a great nation's energies and resources, not for conquest, but to win freedom for men who would be free everywhere.
Mighty America had come fully alive. A revitalized agriculture reached the largest food production goals in the history of mankind. Food not only for ourselves and our allies, but for the hungry populations of the countries our armies would liberate and occupy. Industrial output staggered the imagination, brought renewed hope to our hard-pressed allies, dismay and consternation to the aggressors. It amazed even ourselves. At long last, the United States had come of age, had found a vitality, a strength and a will to do that was phenomenal in all the annals of men and nations. Great convoys of ships stretched out as far as the eye could see, carrying the millions of tons of cargo we kept pouring overseas. All of this in support of G.I. Joe. He was and is the American soldier personified. And who were his leaders? Marshall, Eisenhower, MacArthur, McNair, Bradley, Devers, Patton, Clark, Hodges, Kruger, Eichelberger, Patch, men like McAuliffe, men who possessed the indomitable spirit and genius of Washington. Winfield Scott, Andrew Jackson, Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, George G. Meade, Robert E. Lee, John J. Pershing. This was the heritage of American military leadership in World War II. A heritage they could not and would not fail. Their one and only goal, victory. From buck privates to four-star generals, these were the priceless outpouring of America's greatest resource, the product of more than a century and a half of freedom, of democracy in action, of a great dream that their forefathers had fought for and made a reality, and which these, their sons, were fighting to preserve. But even amidst the tensions of war, there were precious hours of respite in which battle-weary men found rest and relaxation and brief moments of humor. But when they fought, in bitter fighting, Nazi tanks hurled back Allied forces to the Algerian border. But then, combined American, British, and French units stopped the German-Italian drive at Kasserine and overran Tunisia. In the Pacific, on bloody Guadalcanal, fighting an entirely different kind of warfare, United States troops overcame the last fanatical Japanese resistance and won complete control of the island and its airfields. In the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Allied bombers sank 8 transports and 4 destroyers of a Japanese convoy of 16 ships. 181 days after the Allied landings in North Africa, Tunis and Bizerte fell before the drive of American, British, and French forces. The drive reached its full fury with lightning speed, in the air and on the ground. The enemy was hit, harder and harder, crushed in a vice from which there was no escape. In 5 days, all German resistance in Tunisia collapsed. The Axis forces surrendered. The myth of Hitler's super race was beginning to crack. In the faraway Aleutian Islands, American troops had landed on Attu. Still farther away in New Guinea, American and Australian troops drove back the stubborn and fanatical enemy in close fighting in malaria-infested jungles. Among the battle casualties we had suffered while fighting in the Buna area were 3 of our general officers, shot in action within less than 100 yards of the Japanese lines. From victories on the deserts of North Africa, the fog-bound Aleutians, to the tropical island of Guadalcanal and the New Guinea jungles, where our troops were driving forward against desperate Japanese resistance, we had indeed spread our forces around the world. Who was it that once said, the United States was incapable of fighting a two-front war? Within less than 16 months, the United States Navy had performed a miracle of salvage. Of all the ships sunk or damaged on December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor, all but 3 were back in service and in fighting trim by May 1943. An achievement on a scale unequaled in naval history. In Russia, the Germans had taken virtually all of Stalingrad by late 1942. Their conquest was short-lived. Early in 1943, the Russians launched a massive counter. Retook Stalingrad, destroying a Nazi army of 330,000. Capturing 17 of Hitler's generals. The tide had started to turn in Russia. In June of 1943, hundreds of Royal Air Force planes engaged in a non-stop aerial offensive over occupied Europe that continued unremittingly for 10 days. While the tide was turning in the air over Hitler's fortress Europe, American Army, Navy, and Air Forces, along with those of Australia and New Zealand, launched a concerted offensive to drive the Japanese out of New Guinea and the northern Solomon Islands. Enemy forces on Rendova Island were wiped out. Our troops drove for the Munda Airfield on New Georgia Island. With all of North Africa in Allied hands, preparations for Operation Husky were begun immediately to attack the soft underbelly of Europe. The immediate target, Sicily. Little time was lost. Only 60 days after the surrender of Axis forces in North Africa, Patton's 7th Army invaded Sicily simultaneously with British and Canadian troops under Montgomery. Some Some 3,000 craft were employed to land an initial force of 160,000 troops. Almost 14,000 vehicles, about 600 tanks, nearly 2,000 guns. But Sicily was held by more than 200,000 Italian and German troops, strongly entrenched on rugged terrain. It was to be a tough, hard-fought campaign.
We invaded Sicily just 18 months after Pearl Harbor. Actually, an incredibly short period of time for a peaceful and unprepared nation to have accomplished so much, to have come so far. It was a brilliant reflection of our military planning and the energy and enterprise that implemented that planning. It was America at its dynamic best. The forces of agriculture, industry, labor and management, finance and manpower coordinated with the military. What the United States alone did in those first 18 months will live long in history. Yes, we had come a long way, but we still had far to go in Europe, still farther in the Pacific. It would be 11 months after the invasion of Sicily before we could build up and coordinate the massive ground, air, and sea forces for the invasion of Normandy. 11 months of bitter fighting